Welcome to The Detail. I am your host, Cathy Antunes, and you are listening to The Detail on WSLR 96.5 LPFM in Sarasota, Florida, and WBPV 100.1 LPFM in Bradenton, Florida. The views and opinions expressed by hosts, guests, and callers on WSLR programs are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of WSLR, its staff, or volunteers. We are also streaming this live in the Facebook group Citizens for Sarasota County. My guest today is Pulitzer Prize winning journalist David Cay Johnston, who is going to tell us a little bit more about himself right now. And I understand you also have some good news from Sarasota. David, thanks so much for joining me.
Well, glad to be with you. I'm now a professor at Rochester Institute of Technology. I call myself an academic utility fielder because I teach criminal justice, journalism, law, and public policy. I was an investigative reporter for 40 years at some of the biggest newspapers in the country. Most of my career was at the Los Angeles Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the New York Times. I've written 8 books, 4 of them bestsellers, 2 of them international bestsellers. And my Pulitzer Prize, plus being a named finalist 3 other times, was for my pieces examining and exposing things in our tax code. The nice piece of news for you is that the local Rochester newspaper today, the Democrat and Chronicle's lead story, is about a couple in Sarasota, Florida, the late Thomas Melly and his widow Judith, who gave $70 million to Hobart and Smith colleges in Geneva, New York, the largest gift by far they have ever received.
70, did you say?
$70 million.
Wow. Wow. That's huge. That is generous.
It's an endowment fund, so it'll throw off $3.5 million a year, and then over time, more and more and more to help students who are attending that very excellent small college on one of the Finger Lakes.
Yes, well, that's fantastic news. I am so happy you're here with us today, David. We're in a different time. I love reading your books. The first one that came to me was Free Lunch, and you described there, because I was working on whether spring training subsidies made sense. That's kind of how I got involved in local politics. I studied history and economics in my undergraduate degree at the University of Virginia because I found they were really related, that when you understood economic issues and what was going on in the world, then people's behavior made a whole lot more sense.
Absolutely.
So I'd like to kick it off because you've been following Donald Trump and covering him for 40 years.
Right.
But there is a backstory because, I grew up, Russia was clearly, our country saw Russia, as the bad guy, right? Like communism and dictatorship, it was understood. It's shifted. I mean, I see people thinking that they're not so bad or their government is not so problematic. But regarding Donald Trump, there's a history with his economic relationships there. And if you could just flesh that out a bit.
Sure. Let me back up from it and lay a little bit of a foundation, Cathy.
Okay.
I wrote a best-selling and award-winning trilogy on the American economy: Perfectly Legal on taxes, Free Lunch, the book you mentioned, on corporate subsidies, and the fine print on the rise of monopolies, oligopolies, and the restraint of trade. And these books champion competitive market capitalism and expose corporate socialism, which is terribly damaging to an economy.
Yes.
The other trilogy I've written is on Donald Trump. I've known and covered Donald since 1988. In fact, that year I wrote about the prospect of him becoming president of the United States, and I wrote about it again in 1992 in my book exposing the fraudulent way New Jersey regulated casinos, a book called Temples of Chance, because to many people, gambling is a religious experience, hence Temples of Chance. And I've paid very close attention to Donald, one of 4 Americans over my career that I identified and said, I should really track these people because they're going to be significant. Daryl Gates, the LA police chief, Jack Welch, who ran GE for
Mm-hmm.
20 years, Barron
Mm-hmm.
Hilton, who tried to steal a fortune from the starving children of the earth left by his father. Because
Wow.
of work, he ultimately had to give it back when he died. And
Hmm.
he got to use it for about 35 years. And
Wow.
Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is beloved by tens of millions of Americans. I'm not sure they would feel that way if they knew who he really was. So, everything the audience should know that you're going to hear from me in the coming hour about Donald Trump is public record,
Mm-hmm.
court files, lawsuits, disclosure statements, my hundreds of hours of time spent with Donald over the years. Um, and in
Can I
30,
just say, I love about one of your books, you have your email there and you say, if you have any questions about anything I've written, you can email me and I'll send you the documentation. Like that's the
and my
level of
and
documentation
my
here.
my Trump trilogy, The Making of Donald Trump, which was a 2016 biography of him.
Mm-hmm.
It's even worse than you think. My assessment of his first year in office, the first time, and the big cheat about how he and his family enriched themselves during the
Mm-hmm.
first Trump administration. Uh, uh, all three of those had an email address. I invited readers to find errors and report them. A single word, which had nothing to do with Donald Trump, is the only error any reader found, which I
Mm-hmm.
promptly corrected in future editions and the ebook. It was just a dumb, my
Yeah,
brain was out
you're
when I wrote a
allowed.
sentence. Anybody who writes investigative books or edits them will tell you to do three books, especially under deadline pressure, and have a single word error is an extraordinary accomplishment. And Donald has been calling me up or telling me to my face for years he's going to sue me. He's got to take my house. He's going to put my 8 kids out on the street. Of course, they're all grown now.
Mm.
And he's never done so because I always very politely say to him, Donald, if you think you have a case, you should bring it. And he never has because even with all the expensive lawyers he's hired to come after me, he's never shown any error in 37 years, not a single
Mm-hmm.
error in
Right.
37 years. So, what people don't know about Donald Trump is that uh, he has spent a great deal of his career gratuitously involved with heavyweight criminals. A lot of people think, well, he was a New York developer, so of course he had to deal with the mob. I think that's
Mm-hmm.
generally a true statement.
Yeah.
But when the big developers in New York, and Trump was never one of the really big developers in New York, much as
No.
he claimed he was,
Mm-hmm.
decided that they had had enough. They went to the FBI and the Justice Department and they said, you got to get these mafia people out of our pockets.
Mm-hmm.
Donald went the direction. He ran to the mobsters. His
Wow.
father, Fred, had a business partner named Willie Tomasello. Willie Tomasello was a front for the Genovese and Gambino crime families, thoroughly documented by law enforcement, state legislative reports, other documents. So Donald Trump's family was in partnership with these vicious New York mob families. We had a concrete strike when Donald was building
Mm-hmm.
Trump Tower. Trump Tower is not your traditional steel girder high rise building. It's concrete. It's a 58 story. Donald always says 68 stories. It's a 58-story concrete building.
Hmm.
And when the concrete strike came, run by mobsters, the flow of concrete stopped everywhere in New York. You were putting in a new driveway, no cement came.
Wow.
You were building some project, they all stopped, except one site in the entire city of New York, all 5 boroughs, and that was Trump
Trump
Tower,
Tower.
which tells
Okay.
you how closely Donald was involved with these mobsters.
Okay.
Um, he had a business partner and a man he did extensive business with who was the personal pilot of his helicopter, the Ivana,
Mm-hmm.
who was, in fact, one of the biggest cocaine smugglers in America. And he was a twice convicted felon when he got caught by the DEA bringing cocaine and marijuana from Colombia to North Miami and then having mules drive it in cars and vans up to Cincinnati.
Mm.
He confessed in writing. I have his confession, everything. He admits it. He admits he handled the drugs, he arranged it, he was in charge. Um,
This is the pilot.
That's right.
Yeah.
But he also supplied Donald with all the helicopters for his high rollers to go to and from the Atlantic City
Atlantic
casinos.
City. Yeah.
And they had
Wow.
other very bizarre financial relationships between Trump and this criminal. So a very strange thing happened. The case was transferred from Cincinnati, Ohio, to Newark, New Jersey, where no crime was alleged to have occurred. The Constitution says you have to be tried in the jurisdiction
Yeah.
where you were accused of a crime.
Offending. Right.
And it was presented to Judge Marianne Trump Berry,
His
Donald's older
sister.
sister, who was pretty new on the bench.
Mm.
Now, she removed herself, it's called a recusal, from the
Hmm.
case.
Sure.
Uh, but Donald's business partner uh, Donald wrote a letter saying Joe Wexelbaum is a stand-up guy. He shouldn't serve any time at all. He's a credit to the community. This is one of the biggest drug traffickers in America. Think about what Donald says these days about drug traffickers.
Yeah. Hmm.
And if you read the letter carefully, what he really says is, hey, Joe, keep your mouth shut and I will take care of you. Well, not only did the case get transferred to his sister's courtroom, and of course, when she removed herself, she had to explain the connection to him that she
Hmm.
often flew in the helicopter. Think about that. A federal judge repeatedly flew in a helicopter piloted by one of the biggest drug traffickers in America.
Yeah.
And the mules who simply drove drugs from Florida to Ohio each got 20 years in prison. Joe served 18 months, and when he got out, he went back to work for Donald. And
Mm.
he moved, even though he said he was broke and couldn't pay his 30,000 in federal fines, he moved into a multi-million-dollar double apartment in Trump Tower. Now,
So,
almost nobody knows that story, even though it's all
right.
public record. It's in my book, The Making of Donald Trump. I wrote
Yeah.
about it in 1992. Donald
So,
supplied children, Cathy, as young as 12 years old, 12, 13, and 14, with liquor, limousines, and hotel suites because they had money to gamble. And when I asked Donald about that, he thought there was really nothing wrong with that. It was just the government wouldn't let him have those children gamble in his casinos.
wait
Think
a
about
minute. Whose kids were these?
the
Who's
various people in
just
South Jersey
any?
and Philadelphia.
Okay.
And
Because,
I gave a speech one day at one of the historic downtown churches in Philadelphia. And I was telling
mm,
about teenage gamblers, and somebody in the audience shouted out, "Oh, you're just making that up. You're a liar." Whereupon somebody else stood up and said, "No, no, 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 no. My teenage daughter had a frequent gambler card at one of the Trump casinos." And
wow.
somebody else
Yeah.
got up and said the same thing. So
Yeah.
the point I want to make very clearly is I don't write things I can't prove. That's why in a career that has, I've saved
Hmm.
the careers of honest cops. I've gotten many, many people sent to prison, some of them for such long sentences they died there. I've ended the careers of more Democrats than Republicans. I'm the only journalist in America who has ever caused a broadcast chain, TV and radio stations, to have to go out of business because I proved they were manipulating their news reports.
Well,
Nobody's
here's,
ever gotten a dime from me in litigation
yeah.
ever. In fact, the couple of times I've been sued, we quickly dispensed with those cases. And I've also done things like I've personally solved murders, I've hunted down cold-blooded killers, I've
That's
exposed
amazing.
spies and
Yeah.
foreign agents.
So, yeah, I remember because we talked about your book, The Making of Donald Trump. I interviewed you a number
About
of
8 years
years
ago.
ago. Yeah. So, given and it's interesting because I have family members who were working in prominent positions in New York City when Donald Trump was a one headed up development for IBM, another was a CFO at NBC. So they knew him,
Mhm.
and they dealt with him. I think a lot of people, my brother caddied at a golf club where he went. And so there's lots of, if you live in New York, it's actually it's like most places. It's a small town, and if you don't know them, you probably know someone who knows them. Anyway, but this the meeting with Zelensky and just understanding the landscape when it comes to Trump finances and Russia. That question I had about they used to be the bad guys. Why does Donald Trump, I think most people don't understand um, well, a lot of people don't know the history that Russia really, for whatever reason, a lot of people have forgotten, like, this is a brutal dictatorship. This is not somebody we get in bed with,
Well,
right? Why is Donald Trump okay with them and
well,
and so hard on Zelensky from his own personal background perspective?
clear back to the days of the old Soviet. The Russians have been courting Donald Trump. Governments all around the world did this. We court people from other countries.
Sure.
And they saw him, as I did, as someone who might be very influential in the future.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1983, there was a Russian mobster who wanted to buy 5 apartments in Trump Tower, and he came to the closing, which Donald attended, with cash. And I don't mean checks, I mean greenbacks for 5 apartments.
Like bags of money.
Yes, yes, paper bags. In
Okay.
19, I
Wow.
think they were paper bags. I wasn't there. In
Okay.
1987, before the fall of the Soviet Union, the Kremlin gave Donald Trump and his first wife an all expenses paid tour of St. Petersburg and Moscow. And so they've been working a long time to make him their friend. Eric, the second son, said in 2008, we're getting all the financing we need out of Russia. And Reuters,
See,
the news service, has documented that Russians repeatedly and frequently, for I think about 150 various Trump apartments around the country, paid super premium prices to Donald Trump for those places. So Donald thinks well of Russia partly because they put money in his pocket. Same thing he said about the Saudis for doing the same thing. But Donald also believes in his own mind that he's really special, that he is the only person fit to be president of the United States. Uh,
mm,
just within the last 4 weeks, he put a statement up on the internet, a manufactured quote attributed by others to Napoleon Bonaparte, and which was also taught to him by his second father, the notorious lawyer Roy Cohn. He who saves his nation violates no law. And
mm.
um, then Donald's the White House, on 3 occasions, posted a photograph of him with a crown and the text, Long live the king. I've been warning people for 9.5 years, almost 10 years now, that Donald wants to be our dictator. He believes that whatever he wants to do is proper. And in his first term, he said, I have an Article 2, referring to our Constitution, that says I can do anything I want as president. I invite listeners to read Article 2. It says nothing of the sort. It essentially could be read as the president is the errand boy of Congress who will do what they direct, and he's commander in chief of the military. But because of this view that he has unlimited power, just like the dictators, Kim in North Korea, Xi in China, Putin in Moscow, MBS in Saudi Arabia, he can do whatever he wants. And you're seeing this play out where, because the Associated Press insists on using the proper name of the Gulf of Mexico,
Yeah.
when Donald wants to call it the Gulf of America, there are 3 bodies that have to do this. One appointed by Trump has adopted Gulf of America, the other 2 have not. He has barred them from the White House. He is sued
The AP,
CBS,
the
the AP, the Associated
Associated
Press,
Press.
nonprofit, 100 and almost 200-year-old news service. And so if you don't speak his language, he's going to come after you. Now, you'll notice in the address to Congress, he began by saying, I've restored free speech in America. But an hour later, he said, we have banned woke and DEI. Well, I'm sorry, then you haven't restored free speech because those are free speech issues. So, with
Mm,
regard to the war, um, Vladimir Putin's army is in very bad straits right now. They are literally, and they acknowledge this, that they are literally relying on donkey carts to bring weapons, new bullets, food to the front lines.
wow.
The new
I did not know that.
There's a
Yeah.
new video out today showing Russian troops running away from the Ukrainian. In World War II, when we were fighting 2 fronts, right, the Pacific and Europe, we
Yes.
lost on average 300 soldiers a day. And I don't mean casualties, I mean killed. We had 300 a day killed. Russia has been losing 1,100 to 1,600 a day
Ugh,
in
wow. That's a
and
lot.
But Donald wants the Russians to win. And the reason, how do you know that? Well, just this morning, before we went on the air, the story broke that he is revoking the visas for almost 250,000 Ukrainians who are allowed to come to this country because their country is being bombed and attacked by Russia. He is going to deport them all back to Ukraine. He cut
Wow.
off U.S. intelligence support to the Ukrainian military. He stopped the shipment of weaponry to Ukraine. And by the way, in repeatedly, Donald says we've spent $350 billion. No, we haven't. We spent one third of that, 120 billion.
120,
He
yeah.
says Europe isn't carrying the load. For every dollar we have spent helping Ukraine, the Europeans have spent $1.50. And
Yeah.
this goes to the nature of Donald. This is a very important thing to understand about him.
That was
He
that moment
creates
when Macron put his hand on his arm and said, that's not true. What you're saying is Europe has
correct.
spent far more, well,
He,
a lot more than us. Yeah.
Macron corrected Donald, which very few people do. So Donald creates his own reality. If he says something that makes it true, even if he contradicts himself. Professor Timothy Snyder at Yale, who is an expert on authoritarianism, has a little different phrase than mine. Donald lives in a fictional world in his head, and that's why he can change the narrative anytime. Because if you're like a novelist, you can just rewrite your scene.
Hmm.
And I don't think people appreciate how disconnected Donald is from facts. He told me one day in 1989 that I said, Donald, we're walking along together on the boardwalk in Atlantic City. And I said, Donald, how much are you worth? And he goes, $3 billion. And I said, I don't believe you. And he stopped, turned to me and said, very, ferociously, he's about 4 inches taller than me. What do you mean you don't believe me? Who's your editor? I'm going to call him. And I said, sure, let me give you his name and number. Well, he didn't really want that. He said, why
Yeah.
don't you believe me? And I said, well, I have been interviewing dozens of contractors who you have not paid for months for the work they're doing for you, the goods they're supplying to you. I'm a newspaper reporter with 8 children, and I pay all my bills on time. If you were worth $3 billion, you would be able to pay these debts. Well, he then told me I didn't know anything about business. By the way, later I had an appointment as a professor of business at the Graduate Business School at Syracuse University, and I've run successful businesses on the side while being a reporter. But later that day, after he told me he was worth $3 billion, Donald
Hmm.
took his helicopter back to Manhattan, and a TV reporter asked him, "How much are you worth?" And he said, $5 billion. He just makes it up. And most journalists don't question
Don't
him. They don't
question.
know where to go find the
Yeah.
record. They don't how to establish the facts. And besides, to a lot of journalists, who wants to let the facts get in the way of a good story?
No, that's true. I wanted to share, I'm just going to put something up on the screen. This is because again, getting to the reality of people's lives in the United States. And I wanted to get your take on this study by the Pew Research Center, where, because I grew up a child of, I was born in 1963. And
Well,
what's that?
well, for those who are just listening, Cathy,
Yeah.
what this shows is that middle class incomes
Right.
grew
So,
from the
yeah,
end of the
just
war
hang
up
on,
until
because what I wanted to share was when I was growing up, there was a collective, most people identified as middle class, and I've read that even people who were wealthy called themselves middle class. There was a collective like team spirit in the country. We were all on the same team, and there was an economic structure that was in place to like Keynesian economics in post World War II that gave rise to this middle class. And so what the schematic shows is that, in 1950 through 1970, the middle class was actually quite strong. And then there was this dwindling during the Reagan years. And by the time 2000 came along, middle class families were actually losing ground. And please go ahead and add anything else from
so
the data. Yeah.
the people in the audience should know that I have been accused by prominent groups on the right of being responsible for the mistaken belief of Americans that there's massive problem with income inequality. Because I spent years in the New York Times, and after I left the New York Times, documenting every year what was going on with incomes and with wealth from the official data. Essentially, from the end of World War II until 1973, the middle class did very well. And then things began to change because of changes in the rules the government has. In 2016, the year that Donald first ran seriously for president, the bottom 90% of Americans, compared to 1973, long before, only got paid through Thanksgiving. Their incomes had not grown to keep up over time. So essentially, they went the last month of the year with no income. And people didn't know why they were like this. That's why I wrote my best-selling trilogy on the economy, Perfectly Legal, Free, and the Fine Print, to explain this to people. And I very carefully wrote it so if you went to high school, if you graduated from high school, you should be able to understand my books.
Okay.
When you factor in the other two big changes in pay, in 1973, if you worked for a big company, you had a pension. It was on top of your salary. About 45% of workers had a pension, but it was a fringe benefit in addition to your salary. And if you had health care, it was entirely paid by the company, tax-free benefit to you. Well, by 2016, we'd gone to 401k plans where you had to save out of your salary, and you had to pay a large deduction for your health care. So that in reality, Americans' disposable incomes, the money they could actually spend, essentially ran out before Halloween. People went more than 2 months with no income compared to their parents or grandparents in 1973.
So when
no
you
wonder
say
people are furious and upset about what's happened to me. And I've said repeatedly, well, the Democrats, they didn't do anything for working class people. They just gave in to various Republican demands that redistributed money upward. And the Rand Corporation, which started as a think tank for the U.S. Air Force, they much later did a study, a very thoroughly documented study, and they showed that $50 trillion, the U.S. economy's output right now is around 29 trillion for the year. $50 trillion was moved up through these devices that I exposed in my books to the top of the income pile. And so the reason people's incomes weren't growing is that a larger and larger share of the income was being shaved off by the top 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000 families. And look at Elon Musk. He's in court trying to get a paycheck for 1 year's work of $46 billion. $46 billion.
He wants that for this his Doge work?
No. This is for Tesla.
Or his contracts.
This is for Tesla. This is in addition to the billions of dollars he collects from the federal government through contracts. And he's trying right now, according to news reports, to get yet another contract. He killed the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration project to maintain and update the maps used by aviators, by pilots. And he wants to have it turned into a contract for him. In the past, we would have said this is just rank corruption.
Yeah. It's like we don't recognize corruption anymore. So just to kind of recap, you had this structure in the economy post-World War II that was organized with different rules in such a way that the little guy got ahead. And it was the most, and which I think is, there were problems back then. But I think what most people who go for, who voted for Trump and the phrase "Make America Great Again," I think that's what they're responding to. It used to be a single salary could support a family and retire with dignity. That's not true anymore. And so these things have really made a huge difference in people's lives. But what neither party, I think, because they're frankly bought by corporations right now, and we could talk a little bit about Citizens United and all those Supreme Court decisions, but there has been over time a degradation. And it started, I would say, actually, maybe in 73 when we were off the gold standard with the dollar. That's why the dollar was the currency for the world, but we were on the gold standard under Nixon. That changed. But then really under Reagan and even under even under Bill Clinton, there were systematic changes that have just worn away at people at the middle class's ability. The system has been rigged in the other direction. And
No, that's Kathy, you're exactly right about that in the broad strokes of what happened here.
yeah,
Essentially, when Ronald Reagan was elected, Americans chose to end the New Deal, which there had been no big bank failures. There'd been a few, but they were very localized and concentrated. The middle classes' real income doubled in the years from the end of the war up to 1973. The incomes of the super wealthy barely grew because there were such high tax rates. And if you
and
were a business
they still lived well.
Yes,
The
no, no, they
super
live
well.
very well. And
Yeah.
if you were a business owner back then, because
Hmm.
of the high corporate profits taxes and individual taxes, say you and I owned a business and you come into me one day as the chief financial person a week before Christmas and you say, we're going to make X million dollars more profit than we thought, and the government's going to take half of that because that was the corporate tax rate. I'm going to say to you, no, it's not. You go out right now and you spend that money by investing it back into the company.
Yes.
Now that we've reduced tax rates to very low levels, corporations keep withdrawing capital to do things like buy their own stock. Well,
Yeah.
when you
The stock
withdraw
buyback.
money
Yeah.
from a business, you are killing jobs. Right now, it takes about $1 million of capital for each new job. Now, if you're running a restaurant, that's not the case, or a shoe repair
Hmm.
shop. But for the economy as a whole, it's $1 million investment for a new job. And in 1986, Congress passed a law, what I call a legal asterisk, that no one in journalism noted at the time and no one reported on until I broke the story, I guess 15 years later, that said you could, as a corporation, pay yourself royalties offshore and take $1 in your American pocket, put it in your pocket in a Caribbean or South Pacific tax haven, and take a deduction for it, even though you still had the dollar. And eventually, one company, just one of the thousands of companies that did this, Apple, had almost $300 billion of untaxed profits offshore. And then during the George W. Bush administration, there was what I call a tax holiday. Instead of paying the 35% tax rate, companies were allowed to pay, if I recall correctly, 8.25 or 8.5% tax rate. That's a lower tax rate than school teachers and police officers pay on the margin.
Yeah.
And under Donald Trump, they did it again, but you didn't have to bring the money back to the United States to take advantage of this. And you got either 8.5 or 15% tax rate, depending on how you had invested the money overseas. And the news coverage of this, apart from the books that I spent years studying, the most boring documents you can imagine, trying to figure out what's going on here, has been very minimal.
It's not even, it's not
Because
there.
if somebody
Yeah.
doesn't announce it, that's what most journalists do. They accurately tell you what was announced, and that's the official version of events, and they accurately tell you the official criticisms of the official version
But
of
they
events.
don't,
But
nothing
if those
else.
have nothing to do with reality,
Yeah.
you don't know.
Yeah. Everybody, if you just joined us, you're listening to The Detail on WSLR 96.5 LPFM in Sarasota, Florida, and WBPV 100.1 LPFM in Bradenton, Florida. Programming at WSLR supported by listeners like you and by Ringling College Galleries and Exhibitions. Ringling College's 2023-24 exhibition season features art from Ringling students, alumni, faculty, and nationally recognized artists from a wide range of mediums and from diverse backgrounds. More information is available at ringlingcollege.gallery. My guest today is David Cay Johnston, a Pulitzer Prize winning author, journalist, author of a trilogy about Donald Trump, a trilogy about America's tax codes and economic realities. I have a kind of a long-winded question statement, and I'd like you to respond to it.
Okay.
regarding these rules, one example, when we as a nation instituted a tax code, the standard, most people have no idea about this. The standard deduction at that time was the amount of money you needed to live on for a year. In other words, the tax code was set up so that the only thing that was taxed was disposable income, not the money you needed to live on. And when I've said this, I was in a guy was giving us a lift. We had gotten a flat tire on I-4, and the guy in the pickup truck, my husband's like, don't talk about politics, because we didn't agree, right? But I was like, did you know this? And he said, no, I had no idea. And I'm like, well, what would you think if there was a candidate who was going to restore that? And so instead of paying on your income beyond, what is it now? I don't know, $5,000. It's the first 65,000 is yours, or the first 75,000 that you need to live on. He's like, oh my God, that would, yeah.
Kathy, let me
So
explain what happened.
yes, okay.
Because absolutely in the right ballpark. First of all, progressive taxes are ancient. They're in the Bible. They were central to the creation of the first democracy in Athens. And Adam Smith, the man who figured out market economics and the benefits of competitive market capitalism, not just capitalism, competitive market capitalism, wrote that you shouldn't tax the necessaries of life. And he gave a list of things that were necessary at the time and pointed out they vary. The necessaries in Scotland were not the same in France or London.
Right.
In the United States, when we began the income tax, which was the year 1914 was the first it applied, it only applied to the top roughly 1% of society. We have expanded and expanded it now. For a single individual, that you get about $14,000 tax-free. If you're a married couple, about 30. If you're an older married couple like my wife and I, you get about $33,000 before you start paying taxes. But the George W. Bush administration, in writing, acknowledged in 2005 to me when I was at the New York Times that once you made $8 million a year or more, your tax burden began to go downhill, began to decline. I reported in 2002 that many large corporations had figured out how to turn the burden of the corporate income tax into a new profit center. And you can imagine the calls and letters the New York Times got that I was obviously a crazy person. Congress ordered a study, the biggest tax study ever done by Congress in response to that story. 1,800 words full of documents. And it showed that not only was I right, but at Enron, they were literally stamping tax documents profit center. They had a rubber stamp, profit center, that they put on them. And this is still going on.
It's been totally, yeah.
Many corporations appear to be paying corporate income taxes, but they're really only giving back a portion of the money they made by delaying them. If you can delay a tax, that's a zero interest loan from the government. So imagine if you could, like Warren Buffett had a loan I found once buried literally in the middle of a 1,000-page document for 2/3 of $1 billion at zero interest, only half of which would be due 34 years in the future. I mean, wouldn't you love to have that deal?
That's a great deal. Yeah.
And so what's happened with our tax system is we've been burdening people at the bottom. Many people in the bottom 90% pay more in payroll taxes, Social Security, Medicare taxes than income taxes. And we know because of data that a consultant leaked that people like Donald Trump, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk pay little to no income tax. Partly because if you're super wealthy, you can borrow against your assets, therefore you have no income. And our tax system needs a complete overhaul. My next book proposes an entirely new federal tax system based entirely on existing law. There's nothing radical about it. It uses ancient principles, which means they are, if we have a principle from the ancient world, like the Bible's progressive taxes on agricultural goods, that is inherently conservative.
Yeah, that's
under
awesome.
my system, all the ancient principles of ease of payment, progressivity, et cetera, are honored, and all of this giveaway filigree where members of Congress have put out their vote to donors. That all gets stripped away so that we have a system that does what an income tax system should do.
Well,
It
that,
taxes surplus incomes. That's what they were called when we got the
right.
income tax 110 years ago. Surplus incomes and only surplus incomes. And that's how
Hmm.
you reinvest in your society. And there's an important principle here that you're seeing attacked right now by the administration. Creating private wealth depends on investing in commonwealth. If we don't build roads and airports, if we don't have clean water and sewage treatment, if we don't have an education system that actually educates people, you will be very limited in your ability to create private wealth unless it's by extraction from people below. That's not creating wealth.
Which is
That's
what's happening.
redistribution upward.
Yeah.
If you want to create wealth, every wealthy society has high taxes. And one of the distinguishing features of poverty-stricken societies is they don't invest in the commonwealth goods and services that are the foundation of private wealth creation.
Well, I would say, every wealthy society has high taxes, but not their taxes on on the surplus, right? I mean, that's really
Yes.
the
Well,
idea. So I hang on,
the
so
one
I
area
want
where
to,
it would, the one area, Cathy, there is one area, Cathy, where it would make sense to have a relative flat tax.
uh-huh.
Over the course of your lifetime, medical bills don't vary a great deal for all people. Most medical bills come in the last 30 days of life,
Yeah.
or the largest portion come in that period. And whether you're Jeff Bezos or you're me, your lifetime healthcare costs are not that different. So having a sales tax or some other tax that, for instance, just taxing food to cover that, since human bodies are essentially chemical engines, that
Hmm.
can make sense. That's what a number of countries that have universal health care do. And by the way, if you want to save money, if we had the French healthcare system, the best in the world by every study ever done, or the German system, which is different but costs the same, both
Mm.
of which have universal care, and instead of the system we have in America, it would save so much money that we could exempt the first $600,000 a married couple make from the income tax. Not the first 30,000, the first 600,000.
Yeah. See, these are the kind of in-depth, you know, policy and economic discussions that are not happening, that have to become, I think, more part of the public square so that people understand this is something we can fix. But the people who are invoking a time that was economically much better, right, are at the
Right.
same time destroying the possibility of it ever being that way again,
Oh,
and
listen, absolutely.
if you're not aware of that, you just it's not about what party you're in. It's not like it's all one side. This is just reality. So I want to turn to Social Security. I think most people, you have an article on DC Report, the website that where a lot of great independent media is published, that you founded this group. And in 1983, Alan Greenspan, who was the head of the Fed, they did an in-depth study of the Social Security system and how it was going to perform in the future. And they looked at three major things. Well, they looked at life expectancy, and they got those numbers right, according to the research on your website. They looked at the birth rate declining, and they anticipated that. What they didn't anticipate, the article, it says Elon Musk, they didn't anticipate Elon Musk, but what they mean is this huge 1% billionaire class of people. And the thing I think most people aren't aware of is that Social Security payroll tax is only collected up to the first $176,000 that people make. And once you make money beyond that, that income isn't taxed in paying into Social Security. And the notion that there's Social Security is going to run out of money is only if we keep a certain legal statute requirement in place.
There's
That so go
the
ahead and explain that if you
article
would.
at DC Report is by an economist who I believe will be recognized in the future after I'm long gone as one of the greatest economic thinkers of all time. She'll
Mm.
be 500 years from now. Every
And
economics
her name
study her.
is,
Stephanie Kelton, Kelton.
okay.
And DCReport.org, which I co-founded, is no ads, free. It's public service journalism. There are very prominent retired journalists who write for us, and academics and others. Almost nobody gets paid. A few people we pay little stipends to.
Hmm.
And we've broken many of the biggest stories over the last 8 years since we were founded that others then picked up on after we broke them. Because we don't operate from press releases and press conferences. We operate from studying the public record. The thing that the Alan Greenspan Commission got wrong was they didn't project that wage growth would flatten out.
Mm.
I just went through those numbers earlier showing people were
Yeah,
worse off in
I'm
2016 than
just
in
gonna,
1973, when you adjust obviously for inflation. So the revenue isn't coming in. If we were to apply the Social Security tax to all labor income, Social Security would be so flush with money that we could probably double the payouts to the poorest half of Social Security recipients, all of whom would be in poverty but for Social Security, and many of whom still are. We do this with Medicare. If you get paid compensation for labor, it's called, or for services, you're taxed on every dollar by Medicare. But the Social Security tax stops at about $176,000.
hmm.
Understand that we have now a huge growing number of people who make over $1 million a year. That's the fastest growing category for the last 25 or 30 years of salaries, over $1 million. Every year we have hundreds of people who are paid over 50 million a year. The most recent year we have data for, which is 2023, I think the average of those people's income was 156 million for the year. That's $3 million a week.
Hmm.
And if they all were taxed fully for Social Security, the problem would go away.
Yeah, yeah,
And it's not like if you make $156 million a year, you can't afford to pay
no. And
6.4% of your income.
And here's the thing, you look at a guy like Elon Musk, right? And a brilliant, I'm just talking about what he's accomplished
Well,
business-wise.
I think it's what
Okay.
people he hired has accomplished. There's very little
Well,
evidence. He
yeah.
personally is the genius here. He bought other people's businesses and hired other people. There's a pretty
Okay.
clear record
So
on it.
my point is, why'd you leave South Africa? Okay. And hang on. And the reason is, I think this country sets the table for success,
Yeah.
right? And if we're setting the table for success and you're able to do in other words, my husband's from Brazil. Walmart tried to make it in Brazil. They had a very tough time. And that's a whole nother story. This country, and why is that? It's because of the work ethic of the people here. It's because everybody's contributing to all this infrastructure. I was watching a video about a couple that was they moved to Portugal, and their internet, they couldn't even get their internet up and running. So the point is, you're benefiting from the table that is set by everybody. So you give back.
So Kathy, let me just carry that a little further.
Yeah.
Why was Elon Musk growing up in South Africa? Because his parents, his Canadian maternal grandparents, were literally Canadian Nazi Party members. And after the Nazis were defeated, they wanted to go to a place where they've
Wow.
said they wanted to be around people who were friendly to them.
The
The U.S.
apartheid crowd.
the U.S. economy's growth since the end of World War II is because of taxpayer investments in science. More than half of the growth in income and GDP since 1945 can be traced directly to taxpayer investments in science. Companies only support, by and large, applied science. They don't do what's called basic research.
That's
But
government's
basic
job.
research is where you find the breakthroughs.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, the Trump administration is slashing this research
Yep.
that made us the marvel of the world. They want to only pay a 15% overhead on grants to universities because that's what foundations pay. What they ignore is the reason that universities take about half off the top of federal research grants is because the grants don't cover the ancillary services. Imagine, for example, Cathy, that you were running a research project where you had 1,000 people come in every week and you had to jab them in the arm with a needle. Now you have all this medical waste to get rid of. That's not covered by the grant. That's covered by the part the university takes. And there's all sorts of similar rules illustrating this. So the Trump administration is in the process right now of they want to tax scholarships. They want to reduce or eliminate Pell Grants and make fewer people eligible for them. I only have a college education because my father was a 100% disabled veteran of World War II, and under the law, that made me a war orphan.
Which is
I
one
got money to
of,
go to school.
but that was one of the rules, right? That set the
Right.
table for the growth of the middle class. Yeah.
Right. And so to the extent that we are not paying attention to the things that have made us well off, we will be damaging our economy, not just in the short run, but over the long term. And, you know, there are American scientists who have left our country to go to China and India because of rules that we have. I've written about one of them in particular that restrict their ability to pursue science wherever it leads for religious and ideological reasons. And so what you're seeing now with Donald in the White House isn't just someone who has declared himself to be our dictator and is consolidating power, removing inspectors general and anybody who would challenge what he's doing, but you're also seeing the destruction of the economic engine of America, scientific research funded by the taxpayers, and our alignment with the Kremlin, with a dictator against a democracy. And, you know, when I was in high school in the 60s, if a teacher had said to us, the day will come when a Republican president and Republican leaders in Congress will align themselves with a dictator in the Kremlin against democracy, I would have gone straight to the principal's office and said, Mr. or Miss or Mrs. So-and-so is crazy and you need to step in.
Yeah.
Because even as a kid, I would have understood that that's where we are.
That's where we are.
That's where we are.
Yeah.
And Donald Trump, remember, said in 2018, after meeting alone, no other Americans in the room, alone with Vladimir Putin for hours, that he takes Vladimir Putin at his word, but he doesn't trust the American intelligence services. This is not normal. This is terrible in the long run for our economy. But most importantly of all, the liberties of the people are being taken away. More than 1 million people died for this country, including my father, even though it took him 20 years after the war to finally succumb. But Donald Trump, you know, a draft dodger, Donald Trump, who calls captured or wounded soldiers suckers and losers, who's ordered that no soldier who's lost a leg or been disfigured by flame is to ever be in his presence.
Really? He said that?
Oh, yeah. No, he had people removed. This is all thoroughly documented stuff. Donald Trump is not advancing the interests of the country. Remember, this is a man who didn't know why there was a memorial at Pearl Harbor. He had to be told by his chief of staff, a retired Marine general, why. How could you not know a date that will live in infamy? Because you're Donald, and my experience with Donald is he's appallingly ignorant. He covers it up because he's the greatest con artist in the history of the world.
Yeah, I mean, he does. There obviously he has a talent with rhetoric.
Horrific talent.
And and you know, there was when I thought he was relatively harmless, I found him funny, and you know, he has a showman type element. But I think if people really understand, because I think what they're yearning for when they say make America great again are those days when we did have more of a collective team attitude and we were structured economically so that people could rise up.
And that prosperity and for strivers to get ahead.
And he is destroying what's remaining of that structure. I mean, it's really
one important thing, Cathy, I want your audience to know. I have people who call me all the time saying, you hate Donald Trump. I don't hate Donald Trump. Okay. No. A cold-blooded black on white killer that I personally hunted down and won freedom for the innocent man who'd been framed for the crime. I didn't hate the killer either. This is business. This is what I do for a living.
Well, it's accountability.
And I investigate people whose influence I think can be pernicious and I'll live or die by my ability to back up with facts the things that I report. But it's not personal. I once wrote about a mafia killer, and the LA Times wouldn't run the story. They just couldn't stomach it. But you would love to go out and spend an evening with this guy, Harry, who's dead now. Um, and he did monstrous things.
Right.
But every cop and FBI agent I interviewed for that story went, "Oh, Harry, great guy." So
Yeah.
this is not about any animus. It's about the facts.
Well, and it's like Tony Soprano, I was saying to my sister, you understand God loves everybody. You watch The Sopranos and there's something about him that's compelling and you're like, but he's a monster. So on that note, David Cay Johnston, I'm very excited about your new book. Whenever that comes out, I'd love for you to come talk about it with us. And
For sure.
it is a treat to talk to someone who knows so much, is so brilliant, and really cares about the common good. So thank you for joining me. Everybody,
Cathy, thank you for having me on again.
Absolutely. You've been listening to The Detail on WSLR 96.5, LPFM in Sarasota, Florida, and WBPV 100.1 LPFM in Bradenton, Florida. Make it a great day, everybody.